Chapter 12, The Dark Island. After this adventure, they sailed on south and a little east for 12 days with a gentle wind, the skies being mostly clear and the air warm. Saw no bird or fish, except that once there were whales spouting a long way to starboard. Lucy and Reepicheep played a good deal of chess at this time. Then on the 13th day, Edmund, from the fighting top, sighted what looked like a great dark mountain rising out of the sea on their port bow. They altered course and made for this land, mostly by oar, for the wind would not serve them to sail northeast. When evening fell, they were still a long way from it, and rowed all night. Next morning the weather was fair, but a flat calm. The dark mass lay ahead, much nearer and larger, but still very dim, so that some thought it was still a long way off, and others thought they were running into a mist. About 9 that morning, very suddenly, it was so close they could see that it was not land at all, nor even, in an ordinary sense, a mist. It was a darkness. It is rather hard to describe, but you will see what it was like if you imagine yourself looking into the mouth of a railway tunnel. A tunnel either so long or so twisty that you cannot see the light at the far end. And you know what it would be like. For a few feet you would see the rails and sleepers and gravel in broad daylight, and then there would come to a place where they were in twilight, and then pretty suddenly, but of course without a sharp dividing line, they would vanish altogether into smooth, solid blackness. It was just so here. For a few feet in front of their bows they could see the swell of the bright greenish blue water. Beyond that they could see water looking pale and gray, as it would look late in the evening. But beyond that again, utter darkness, as if they had come to the edge of moonless and starless night. Caspian shouted to the boatswain to keep her back, and all except the rowers rushed forward and gazed from the bows. But there was nothing to be seen by gazing. Behind them there was the sea and the sun, before them the darkness. "Do we go into this?" asked Caspian at length. "Not by my advice," said Drinian. "The captain's right," said several sailors. "I almost think he is," said Edmund. Lucy and Eustace didn't speak, but they felt very glad inside of the turn things seemed to be taking. But all at once the clear voice of Reepicheep broke in upon the silence. "And why not?" he said. "Will someone explain to me why not?" No one was anxious to explain. So Reepicheep continued. "If I were addressing peasants or slaves," he said, "I might suppose that this suggestion proceeded from cowardice. But I hope it will never be told in Narnia that a company of noble and royal persons in the flower of their age turned tail because they were afraid of the dark." "But what manner would it be to plough through that blackness?" asked Drinian. "Use?" replied Reepicheep. "Use, Captain? If by use you mean filling our bellies or our purses, I confess it will be no use at all. So far as I know, we did not set sail to look for things useful, but to seek honor and adventure. And here is as great an adventure as I ever heard of. And here, if we turn back, no little impeachment of all our honors." Several of the sailors said things under their breath that sounded something like, "Honor be blowed," but Caspian said, "Bother you, Reepicheep. I almost wish we'd left you at home." "All right. If you put it that way, I suppose we shall have to go on. Unless Lucy would rather not." Lucy felt she would very much rather not, but what she said out loud was, "I'm game." "Your Majesty will at least order lights?" said Drinian. "By all means," said Caspian. "See to it, Captain." So the 3 lanterns at the stern, and the prow, and the masthead were all lit, and Drinian ordered 2 torches amidship. Pale and feeble they looked in the sunlight. Then all the men, except some who were left below at the oars, were ordered on deck and fully armed and posted in their battle stations with swords drawn. Lucy and 2 archers were posted on the fighting top with bows bent and arrows on the string. Rheinelf was in the bows with his line ready to take soundings. Reepicheep, Edmund, Eustace, and Caspian, glittering in mail, were with him. Drinian took the tiller. And now, in Aslan's name, forward, cried Caspian. A slow, steady stroke, and let every man be silent and keep his ears open for orders. With a creak and a groan, the Dawn Treader started to creep forward as the men began to row. Lucy, up in the fighting top, had a wonderful view of the exact moment at which they entered the darkness. The bows had already disappeared before the sunlight had left the stern. She saw it go. At one minute, the gilded stern, the blue sea, the sky were all in broad daylight. Next minute, the sea and sky had vanished. The stern lantern, which had been hardly noticeable before, was the only thing to show where the ship ended. In front of the lantern, she could see the black shape of Drinian crouching at the tiller. Down below her, the two torches made visible two small patches of deck and gleamed on swords and helmets. And forward, there was another island of light at the forecastle. Apart from that, the fighting top, lit by the masthead light, which was only just above her, seemed to be a little lighted world of its own, floating in lonely darkness. And the lights themselves, as always happens when you have to have them at the wrong time of day, looked lurid and unnatural. She also noticed she was very cold. How long this voyage into darkness lasted, nobody knew. Except for the creak of the rowlocks and the splash of the oars, there was nothing to show that they were moving at all. Edmund, peering from the bows, could see nothing except the reflection of the lantern in the water before him. It looked a greasy sort of reflection, and the ripple made by their advancing prow appeared to be heavy, small, and lifeless. As time went on, everyone except the rowers began to shiver with cold. Suddenly, from somewhere, no one's sense of direction was very clear by now, there came a cry. Either of some inhuman voice, or else the voice of one in such the extremity of terror that he had almost lost his humanity. Caspian was still trying to speak. His mouth was too dry, when the shrill voice of Reepicheep, which sounded louder than usual in that silence, was heard. "Who calls?" it piped. "If you are a foe, we do not fear you, and if you are a friend, your enemies shall be taught the fear of us." "Mercy!" cried the voice. "Mercy! Even if you were only one more dream, have mercy! Take me on board! Take me even if you strike me dead! But in the name of all mercies, do not fade away and leave me on this horrible land!" "Where are you?" shouted Caspian. "Come aboard and welcome!" There came another cry, whether of joy or terror, and they knew someone was swimming toward them. "Stand by to heave him up, men," said Caspian. "Aye, your majesty," said the sailors. Several crowded to the port bulwark where the ropes were, leaning far out over the side, and held a torch. A wild, white face appeared in the blackness of the water, and then, after some scrambling and pulling, a dozen friendly hands had heaved the stranger on board. Edmund thought he had never seen a wilder-looking man. Though he did not otherwise look very old, his hair was an untidy mop of white. His face was thin, drawn. For clothing, he only had a few wet rags that hung about him. What one mainly noticed were his eyes, which were so widely opened he seemed to have no eyelids at all, and stared as if in an agony of pure fear. The moment his feet touched the deck, he said, "Fly! Fly! About with your ship and fly! Row, row, row for your lives away from this accursed shore! Compose yourself," said Reepicheep, "and tell us what the danger is. We are not used to flying." The stranger started horribly at the voice of the mouse, which he had not noticed before. "Nevertheless, you will fly from here," he gasped. "This is the island where dreams come true." That's the island I've been looking for this long time," said one of the soldiers. I'd reckon I'd find I was married to Nancy if we landed there." "And I'd find Tom alive again," said the others. "Fool!" said the man, stamping his foot with rage. "That is the sort of talk that brought me here. I would have better been drowned or never born. Do you hear what I say? This is where dreams, do you understand, come to life, come real, not daydreams, dreams." There was about half a minute's silence, And then, with a great clatter of armor, the whole crew were tumbling down to the main hatch as quick as they could, flinging themselves on the oars to row as they had never rowed before. Andrinian was swinging around the tiller, and the boatswain was giving out the quickest stroke that had ever been heard at sea. For it had taken everyone just that half-minute to remember certain dreams they had had, dreams that make you afraid of going to sleep ever again, and to realize what it would mean to land in a country where dreams come true. Only Reepicheep remained unmoved. "Your Majesty, he said, are you going to tolerate this mutiny, this poltroonery? This is a panic! This is a rout! Row! Row! Bellowed Caspian. Pull for all our lives! In her head, right, Drinian? You say what you like, Reepicheep. There are some things no man can face. It is then my good fortune not to be a man, replied Reepicheep with a very stiff bow. Lucy from up aloft had heard it all. In an instant, that one of her own dreams, which she had tried her hardest to forget, came back to her as vividly as if she had only just woken from it. So that was what was behind them on the island in the darkness. For a second, she wanted to go down to the deck and be with Edmund and Caspian, but what was the use? If dreams began coming true, Edmund and Caspian themselves might turn into something horrible just as she reached them. She gripped the rail of the fighting top and tried to steady herself. They were rowing back to the light as hard as they could. It would be all right in a few seconds, but oh, it could be all right now. Though the rowing made a good deal of noise, it did not quite conceal the total silence which surrounded the ship. Everyone knew it would be better not to listen, not to strain his ears for any sound from the darkness, but no one could help listening. As soon as everyone was hearing things, each one heard something different. Do you hear a noise like a huge pair of scissors opening and shutting over there? Eustace asked Rheinelf. Hush, said Rheinelf. I can hear them crawling up the sides of the ship. It's just going to settle on the mast, said Caspian. Oh, said a sailor. There are the gongs beginning. I knew they would. Caspian, trying not to look at anything, especially not to keep looking behind him, went aft to Drinian. Drinian, he said in a low voice, how long did we take rowing in? I mean, rowing to where we picked up the stranger. 5 minutes, perhaps, whispered Drinian. Why? Because we've already been at that already, trying to get out. Drinian's hand shook on the tiller, and a line of cold sweat ran down his face. The same idea was occurring to everyone on board. We shall never get out. Never get out, moaned the rowers. He's steering us wrong. We're going round and round in circles. We shall never get out. The stranger, who had been lying in a huddled heap on the deck, sat up and burst out in a horrible, screaming laugh. Never get out, he yelled. That's it, of course. We shall never get out. What a fool I was to think they would ever let me go as easily as that. No, no, we shall never get out. Lucy leant her head on the edge of the fighting top and whispered, Aslan, Aslan, if you ever loved us at all, send help now. The darkness did not grow any less, but she began to feel a very, very little better. After all, nothing has really happened to us yet, she thought. Look! Cried Rheinelf's voice hoarsely from the bows. There was a tiny speck of light ahead, and while they watched, a broad beam of light fell from it upon the ship. It did not alter the surrounding darkness, but the whole ship was lit up as if by searchlight. Caspian blinked, stared around, saw the faces of his companions with all their wild, fixed expressions. Everyone was staring in the same direction. Behind everyone lay his black, sharply edged shadow. Lucy stood along the beam and presently saw something in it. At first, it looked like a cross. Then, it looked like an airplane. And then, it looked like a kite. And at last, with a whirring of wings, it was right overhead, and it was an albatross. It circled 3 times round the mast, and then perched for a moment on the crest of the gilded dragon on the prow. It called out in a strong, sweet voice, which seemed to be words, though no one understood them. After that, it spread its wings, rose, and began to fly slowly ahead, bearing just a little starboard. Drinian steered after it, not doubting that it offered good guidance. But no one except Lucy knew that as it circled the mast, it had whispered to her, "Courage, dear heart," said the voice. She felt sure it was Aslan's, and with the voice a delicious smell breathed in her face. In a few moments, the darkness turned into a grayness ahead, and then, almost before they dared to begin hoping, they had shot out into the sunlight and were in the warm blue world again. And all at once, everyone realized that there was nothing to be afraid of, and never had been. They blinked their eyes and looked about them. The brightness of the ship herself astonished them. They had half expected to find that the darkness would cling to the white and the green and the gold in the form of some grime or scum. And then first one and then another began laughing. "I reckon we've made pretty good fools of ourselves," said Rheinalf. Lucy lost no time in coming down to the deck, where she found the others all gathered round the newcomer. For a long time, he too was happy to speak, and could only gaze at the sea and the sun and feel the bulwarks and the ropes, as if to make sure he was really awake, while tears rolled down his cheeks. "Thank you," he said at last. You have saved me from... But I won't talk of that. And now, let me know who you are. I am a Telmarine of Narnia. When I was worth anything, men called me the Lord Roop." "And I," said Caspian, "and Caspian, King of Narnia, and I sail to find you and your companions who were my father's friends." Lord Roop fell on his knees and kissed the king's hand. "Sire," he said, "you are the man in all the world I most wished to see. Grant me a boon." "What is it?" asked Caspian. "Never to bring me back there," he said. He pointed astern. They all looked, but they saw only bright blue sea and bright blue sky. The dark island and the darkness had vanished forever. "Why," cried the Lord Roop, "you have destroyed it!" "I don't think it was us," said Lucy. "Sire," said Drinian, "this fair wind is fair for the southeast. Shall I put our poor fellows up and set sail? And after that every man who can be spared to his hammock." "Yes," said Caspian, "and let there be grog all round. Hi-ho! I feel as if I could sleep the clock round myself." So all afternoon, with great joy, they sailed southeast with a fair wind, but nobody noticed when the albatross had disappeared. And that's the end of chapter 12. And what started off as ominous and kind of scary, sailing into what looked like total darkness, turned into something that maybe none of us were prepared to expect. A land where dreams come true. Not dreams in the sense of what I wish or what I hope for, but that sort of wild, untamable imagination where nothing makes sense and anything can happen and we lack any sort of control. Think of the worst dreams or those darkest moments of anxiety or imagination. In this life, are there things that we fear more than our own imaginations? Our worry about the future and what it might hold? Our concern about how things could go wrong or how bad they might hurt or what awful things could occur and the sad consequences that might follow? That's not the future as a real thing, as a solid thing like the past or our present. That's something that's alive really in our imaginations only. But still, how much of the fear of life is not found right there, where we cannot always control it, and where it seems that there is no rhyme or reason, dreams that would make us want to stay awake forever. But even in that darkness, a cry for help, and help comes. Help at an albatross that leads them through with light and on into safety, even destroying the darkness of fear itself. The words spoken to Lucy are the words we long to hear, and we can hear if only our ears will listen. In the midst of darkness and dreams and fear, hear the voice of our Lord. Courage, dear one.